It's been about 6 months since the 60mm 6.0 Ruby was released for the first time, and it has quickly become one of the most popular paddles on the market. It has become so popular, in fact, that it's actually sold out multiple times since its release. However, nowadays there are a ton of different Kevlar paddles and paddles in general out there, so that really begs the question, is this paddle still worth it, and how good is this paddle really? Don't forget to sub if you enjoy, and let's get into things. Let's start off with power. Now, for not being a power paddle, I have to say you are surprisingly able to generate a decent amount of power with this thing. That said, it definitely doesn't hit as hard as some of the newer paddles out there, especially the actual power paddles like the Gearbox or Gen 3s. Rest in peace. Still, one of the reasons I think the Ruby does hit slightly harder than your average paddle is because it has a little more weight to it than you might expect, and I think a bit of that extra weight actually helps a lot in being able to drive harder. To that point, I did have an initial concern that the extra weight would make it harder to use in hands battles, but it surprisingly didn't make that much of a difference. The other thing I noticed that when using it, it doesn't really have that same plush feeling that some control paddles do. In fact, the surface actually feels really hard when you hit with it, but for power's sake, I think that's actually a good thing because it's that harder Kevlar surface that actually allows the ball to come off a touch harder and faster than your typical control paddle. Drive specifically felt so much better as well compared to some of the softer paddles I've used. That said, you still have to put a lot of effort in your swings. It wasn't just like some paddles where you could just flick your wrist and the ball would fly across the court. The pop, on the other hand, is a bit of a different story. While it's not the absolute worst paddle I've seen when it comes to pop, it definitely isn't the best. The ball really doesn't spring off the surface unless you again generate that power yourself, so you really need to be a bit more aggressive with your movements for any volleys or hand battles that you get into. It is kind of useful in that aspect for dinks or resets though. Also, random side note too, it's worth noting that the power with the Ruby really hasn't changed throughout the time I've used it. There's some paddles out there that seem to hit harder once you break them in, but the Ruby didn't seem to be one of them. Overall for power though, I would give it a 6.5 out of 10. Alright, now let's talk control. So long story short, this paddle, as expected, has pretty solid control. Now again, I don't think it's on the same level as some of the main control paddles out there, but at the end of the day, I feel really comfortable hitting drops, dinks, and basically the entire soft game with this. One of my main concerns when I first started hitting with the Ruby was that because I was able to generate a bit more power than a typical control paddle, I was afraid I would lose a lot of control in exchange for that, but that really wasn't the case. It did take a bit of adjusting to get used to, specifically to that stiffer and more harder surface, but after a few games, it was actually really easy to transition into. A lot more so than some of the poppier paddles out there. Also, for such a hard surface, you're surprisingly able to get a lot of dwell time with the ball as well, and it really allows you to place the ball consistently and accurately. This also really helps with drops and just being able to grab the ball and place it where you want. Dinks also feel pretty good with the Ruby. It's not quite as comfortable as some of the other control paddles out there, but it also doesn't have that random poppiness to it, which is actually really nice when you're trying to be consistent. Overall though, for control, I would give it a solid 7.5 out of 10. Alright, now let's talk about the main highlight of this paddle, and that would be spin. So the spin with the Ruby is actually pretty dang solid. Some of that is because of the Kevlar surface, and some of that is also just because it came pretty gritty. But I think it's a combination of the two that really helps put the Ruby above some of the other paddles out there for spin. Speaking of combinations, it's also the combination of spin and its other attributes that make the Ruby such a good paddle. On drives, that extra spin really allows you to put a nice arch on the ball and hit that low spot right behind the net, making it really difficult to volley, and the same thing goes for drops. The spin you can get on this is definitely one of the strongest parts of this paddle, and it's also worth noting that even after playing with this paddle a lot, the grit on it actually hasn't changed too much. I mean, it's definitely worn down a bit, but in my opinion, the grit has lasted longer than the average paddle would, which is probably partially thanks to the Kevlar surface. Overall for spin though, I would give it an 8 out of 10. Alright, let's get into the sweet spot real quick because this is kind of interesting. So the first few times I played with this, I remember the sweet spot being not that great. Probably one of the worst sweet spots I've experienced right off the bat, if I'm being honest. I felt like if I didn't hit it dead center, then the entire paddle would rattle a bit and the ball would die. What's weird is as soon as I put an overgrip on the handle, the rattling instantly went away, and I haven't had a big sweet spot issue since. I think it's actually that extra grip that helps dampen the paddle a bit, which prevents the rattling, but that's just a theory. Even so, it's kind of hard to say, and I'm probably over exaggerating slightly, but either way, if I do have one recommendation to you if you plan on getting the Ruby, it's that you should get an overgrip. Speaking of, let's go over some of the cons of this paddle real quick. For starters, the handle. Besides the overgrip issue, the default standard handle and grip it comes with isn't actually that great. One, of course, because of the rattling that occurs while using it, and two, I personally just didn't like the feel of it much. It just felt a bit uncomfortable, but that could just be my opinion too. Additionally, the frame and edge guard of this paddle is white, which, don't get me wrong, it makes this paddle look incredible. The combination between the white and the red Kevlar makes this easily one of the best looking paddles out there. That is until you remember how easily scrapes show up on white. In other words, if you don't cover up the sides, it's probably going to collect some big scuff marks over time, but again, if you're not worried about that, then just ignore this. Another con is the weight on it. So over the course of the rubies being out, I've noticed that some rubies felt slightly heavier than others. It wasn't by much, but it was noticeable enough that I could feel it. So that is something to keep an eye out for as well. And lastly, the biggest con is probably the cost. I mean, it is a $200 paddle after all. And now that there's so many other Kevlar paddles on the market that are also cheaper, it kind of makes you wonder, is it even worth getting the ruby anymore? Some of the paddles allegedly, even though I haven't confirmed this personally yet, seem almost identical to the ruby, like the J2K Sword and Shield. But still, I do think there could still be a place in today's world for the ruby, as it has already proven itself as a reliable paddle over a long period of time, which others haven't done yet. That said, if a paddle does prove itself that's cheaper, probably get the cheaper one. At the end of the day, the ruby really is a solid paddle though. In fact, I've liked this paddle so much that I've actually used it as my main paddle for a while now, because it had exactly what I was looking for. I really wanted a paddle that gave me a bit of extra power without the cost of losing a lot of control, and I felt like the ruby had done just that for me. And can maybe do that for your game as well if that's what you're looking for. That said, 6.0 has been teasing the re-release of the 14mm ruby, which seems like it's coming soon. So if you're looking for a version of this paddle that is slightly lighter and one that will probably hit a bit harder, then you might want to hold off until that's released. Other than that, that's all I got for now. If any of this was helpful, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Peace.